Boldwood presents The Island of Dreams, written by Helen McGinn and read by Emma Powell. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Martha Williams had a feeling today wasn't going to be her day. It had started quite promisingly. She'd bagged the last almond croissant at the cafe she always stopped at on her way to the station before getting a window seat on the train. Then things had started to go wrong. Crossing her legs as she sat on the train trying to read her book, she'd noticed a mark on her dress. Scratching it had only made it worse. She'd gone to put on her favourite lipstick, only to find the lid had come off, leaving sticky red smears across the contents of her handbag. By the time she got to Waterloo, the sun that had been shining so brightly when she'd left her flat barely half an hour before had disappeared behind thick, dark clouds. As she stepped out onto the street to make the short walk to work, the heavens opened. Martha rummaged through her handbag for her umbrella, resulting in more lipstick on her fingers, only to find she'd left it at home. Instead, she pulled her trench coat over her head and made a run for it. She crossed the small courtyard of the old red-brick school that was her workplace, fat raindrops falling down her face. Deciding to avoid the staff room, Martha headed straight to the staff loos to survey the damage in the mirror. Her dark hair hung heavily, strands sticking to her damp skin. She took off her glasses and wiped the smudged mascara from under her eyes with a paper towel. Shrugging off her coat, she shook her head under the hand dryer to get some of the water out. "Morning, Martha," said a slightly too cheerful for that time in the morning voice. Martha didn't even have to look up to know who it was. "Morning, Janet." Janet was the school receptionist with a habit of stating the obvious with a side order of smug. "Someone got a soaking this morning. I left a little earlier when I saw the forecast, managed to miss it." "Well done you," Martha said without a smile. "So organised." She stood upright again and pulled her hair back into a ponytail. "Right, I better get going." "Oh, yes, big day today, last day of term. Always so sad to see them go." Janet sighed. "Well, not all of them," said Martha, laughing. Janet looked blank. "I mean, they're great kids, it's just, Martha tailed off. "It's been a long year. I'm sure you're looking forward to the summer holidays just as much as they are." Janet smiled tightly and turned, disappearing into a cubicle. Martha took one last look at us, making her way down the long, still empty corridor to the staff room. She scanned the room for a familiar, friendly face. Over on the other side, she spotted her fellow teacher and beloved friend, Joni. "What the hell happened to you?" "Morning, Joni. Nice to see you too. How can you eat those this early in the morning?" Martha gestured at the packet of pickled onion-flavoured crisps in Joni's hand. "Easy," she said, popping a few in her mouth. "You sure you don't want some?" She proffered the packet. Martha sat down next to her on the old battered staff room sofa and shook her head. "You're all hard, but no, thanks." "You coming out for drinks later?" Joni licked her fingers, the smell of the crisps wafting over to Martha. "I wish I could, but I can't. Got to run for a train straight from here after school. I'm heading down to my parents' house tonight." "Oh, yes, you did say. The big pre-wedding dinner." Joni's eyes widened. "Clearly you decided not to tell your sister she's marrying a total dick then?" Martha scowled at her friend. "Really? You're going there? What's his name again?" "Toby." She'd gone over this so many times in her head, but somehow it didn't feel right to tell her older sister Iris that, in Martha's opinion, she really wasn't sure about him. Toby and Iris hadn't even been together for that long, but Iris had insisted that he was, without doubt, the one. "When's the wedding again?" Joni asked. "A week tomorrow," Martha sighed. "It's weird, Joni. I hardly know him, but there's just something about him. I don't know." She shivered slightly. The rest of the family was seemingly really keen on Toby, and the wedding was all anyone had talked about for months. Martha's elder sister, Liv's wedding, just a few years before, had been a very quiet affair, a handful of close friends and family only at a London register office. Liv and her husband Jimmy already had a toddler and a 6-month-old baby by the time they decided to get married, and the whole day had been utterly perfect. Iris's impending nuptials were a totally different story. There was to be a big marquee in the garden of their parents' house in Devon with well over 100 guests invited. The band had been booked, the wedding breakfast discussed and changed so many times Martha had lost count, not to mention interest. "And you're not going to say anything?" Joni looked at Martha and raised an eyebrow. "I can't, Joni. Can you imagine? Iris says she loves him. But you're all so close, aren't you?" "It's complicated. I love my sister dearly, but if I just throw that in without anything to back it up and then she marries him anyway, it just sits there forever. If I'm honest, I think she must know I'm not his biggest fan." Joni shrugged. Martha smiled. "I will." She stood up and offered her hand to Joni, pulling her out of the sagging sofa. "Ready for one last assembly?" "Can't bloody wait," said Joni, scrunching up the empty crisp packet with her other hand. "Martha, can I have a quick word with you?" Martha turned to see her boss, the school head teacher, an imposing woman called Mrs. Browning. "Yes, of course." Martha raised an eyebrow at Joni, then turned and followed Mrs. Browning back down the corridor towards her office, the head teacher's sensible shoes squeaking on the shiny blue floor below as she strode ahead with purpose. Martha glanced at her own battered Chelsea boots, socks poking out of the top, wishing she'd worn something a little smarter. Mrs. Browning opened the door and gestured for Martha to take a seat. "Please sit down, Martha. Now, I realise this is a little last minute and not quite as I'd hoped to do things, but it seems we're going to have a vacancy in the English department. Head of English, in fact." Martha's stomach flipped. "What about—" "Mr. Bentley is leaving us after today. He's been poached by the lot down the road." Mrs. Browning tilted her head a little. Martha presumed she was referring to the nearby private school. They were always trying to pinch the best teachers. "Anyway, with the holidays coming up, I'd like you to consider taking the position at the start of next term. If you want it, the job is yours. I'm aware that you basically run the English department anyway. The hours are longer, but the pay not much better, I'm afraid. Anyway, I wanted you to have the chance to give it some thought, and I'll be in touch." Martha sat open-mouthed for a moment, lost for words. Her job was all-consuming, exhausting, relentless and stressful. But she loved her subject, and most of the time she loved teaching it to her students, even if they sometimes annoyed the hell out of her. Thank you. Quite unexpected." Martha nodded and smiled, trying not to let her emotions get the better of her. She was so happy she could have cried. "Wonderful. Thank you, Martha. Right, we'd better head down to the hall." Suddenly, Martha's day was looking up. The day passed in the usual chaotic manner, as all last days of term did. There was a sense of excitement in the air as Martha's pupils hugged and signed each other's shirts. As they left her classroom, she collected up the textbooks left on the tables and piled them neatly on her desk at the front. She wiped the board clean and sat down, enjoying the silence of the empty room for a moment. She thought about the weekend ahead, her heart lifting at the prospect of getting out of town and escaping to the familiar comfort of her childhood home for a few days. She assumed her sisters would already be there by the time she arrived. Liv and Jimmy lived near to her parents. Iris was travelling down with Toby in the car and had offered Martha a lift, but Martha had insisted they go without her, saying she couldn't be sure what time she'd be able to get away. The truth was, she didn't want to be stuck in a car for 3 hours with them, talking wedding plans when she'd rather travel on her own with nothing but a book and some music in her ears for company. She thought about what Joni had said to her earlier in the staff room. Maybe she should have said something to Iris, but it was complicated. Martha had grown up watching and observing her 2 older sisters, just a few years in age between them. Martha had come along almost 8 years after Iris. The age gap was such that growing up she'd sometimes felt like an only child. Even now she felt they treated her more like a teenager than a woman in her mid-30s. Martha's phone vibrated in her pocket. She looked at the screen. a message from her mother asking what time her train got in. She knew her father would be there to collect her as he always was, usually waiting on the platform in his usual navy jumper with holes at the elbows. She gathered up her coat and bag from the back of the chair and made her way to the door. No, she couldn't risk saying anything to Iris. It was just a feeling, after all. An hour later, as the train raced away from London and headed deep into the countryside, Martha felt her shoulders drop as green fields flew past the window, the early evening sun casting its golden light across them. She tapped at her phone and put on a favourite playlist that reminded her of home, music she'd grown up listening to. As familiar 70s folk songs flooded her ears, she picked up her book from the table in front of her and started to read. Soon she was lost in the words on the page, the characters speaking so clearly in her mind it was as if they were sitting right next to her. The hours whizzed by as fast as the scenery outside. By the time the train pulled into the station near her parents' house, the sun had dipped almost to the horizon, streaking the sky deep orange and pink. Martha reached for her bag above her seat and made her way to the door. She heard her father's voice as she stepped onto the short platform. "Hello, darling." Martha's father held his arms out as he walked towards her. He was tall and a little stooped with age. He still had a full head of hair, now grey rather than very dark brown as it once was, and his eyes were bright like Martha's. Martha dropped her bag and hugged him tightly. "Hi, Dad. How are you?" "Thrilled you're here." He held her by the shoulders. "Everyone's so looking forward to seeing you. Here." He picked up her bag. "I'll take that. How was your journey?" "Oh, fine," Martha sighed. "Nearly finished my book. Well, it's not quite my last day. We're back in next week to wrap up the year and start planning for next term. Oh, and I have news. I've been asked to apply for head of department. Well, it's mine if I want it, apparently." "Oh, Martha, that's fantastic news." Her father beamed at her, his eyes glistening with tears. "Thanks. I wasn't expecting it. It does mean more work for not much more money, but I'd be mad not to take it." "Absolutely you must. Car's this way." Her father gestured to an old blue estate car. "Crikey, is that still going?" Her parents had had it for as long as Martha could remember. "Most of the time." He laughed. "Are Liv and Jimmy at home?" "Not yet. It was just Mum, Iris and Toby when I left, but they might have arrived by the time we get back. You made good time, though." "And how are the wedding plans?" Martha tried her best to sound bright and breezy. Her father hesitated for just a moment. "All good, I think. I'm staying out of it as much as possible, to be honest. I don't really have strong feelings when it comes to whether they have a cake or croquembouche, whatever that might be." "Very sensible." "You've met Toby a few times, haven't you?" "Yes, why?" Martha glanced at her father, seeing what she could read from his face. He kept his gaze ahead. "What do you think?" He's fine. I mean, I don't really know him very well, to be fair, and Iris seems very happy, so..." Martha couldn't think of what else to say. "Yes, she does." There was another brief silence between them. She wondered whether he, too, wasn't sure about his prospective son-in-law, but didn't want to say it out loud. Martha's father started the car and nosed out of the car park and back onto the main road. After about half a mile, they took the small turning towards their village. High hedges on either side kept the sea just out of view as they followed the narrowing track, twisting and turning their way down the steep hill towards the house. "Can't believe Liv's never met him either. She used to practically interview all of Iris's boyfriends when they lived together." Martha's sisters had shared a flat in London for years when they'd both worked there, before Liv met Jimmy. "Well, I'm sure he'll be able to hold his own." Her father laughed gently. They turned into a driveway marked either side by old staddle stones and drove up to the front of the house, a beautiful wisteria-covered pale stone building overlooking a gently sloping lawn bordered by huge rhododendrons. Behind sat a backdrop of beech woods. "Home," Martha whispered, suddenly grateful to be out of her tiny, damp flat at least for the weekend ahead. She knew her parents would be horrified if they knew where she was living. They'd never seen it, and she hoped they never would. Her mother appeared at the door on the side of the house, hair up and apron on, followed closely by an old black Labrador and 2 small brown spaniels. "You're here!" she cried, opening the car door. "Hi, Mum." Martha stood to hug her mother. "My goodness, let me look at you." As ever, her mother looked quite beautiful. Her grey hair held back from her face with a bright blue silk scarf. Her piercing eyes, the same colour as the scarf, swept over Martha. "You look wonderful, darling." Martha laughed. "Mum, you always say that. I'm knackered." She knew she looked tired, and her hair had gone frizzy at the ends, having never quite recovered after the soaking that morning. "John, did you get my message?" Martha's father looked at her blankly. "I messaged you. We've run out of milk. I wanted you to pick some up from the garage shop on your way past." "Sorry, Pen, I didn't. Can we ask Liv to bring some?" "No, they're already here. Never mind, we'll make do without. Martha, come and say hello to everyone. I've just got to go and check on the potatoes." Martha followed her mother into the kitchen. The old farmhouse table was already set for dinner, a multitude of flowers from the garden spilling out of a huge vase in the middle. Along the wall behind sat an old crowded dresser, its shelves covered with mismatched crockery, dog-eared photos, old invitations and postcards propped up wherever there was space. "You go on through, Martha," said her father. "I'll put your bag at the bottom of the stairs and bring you a drink. Gin and tonic?" "Yes, please," said Martha. "Are they through there?" "Yes, in the sitting room." He let her go ahead. Martha headed down the hall. She loved the way the house always smelt the same, a mix of cooking and dogs and wood smoke. As she walked into the sitting room at the front of the house, her sisters cried her name in unison. Liv was the first to leap up and reach her for a hug. "You're here! How are you?" "Oh, it's so good to see you." Martha squeezed her eldest sister tightly. She looked across at Jimmy, standing just behind. "Hi, how are you?" He waved and nodded, mumbling his usual cheerful hello. Martha always thought his unruly grey curls made him look part mad professor, part ageing rocker. "My turn." Iris tapped Martha on the shoulder, smiling. "Iris!" Martha kissed her on both cheeks. Unlike her sisters, Iris wasn't really a hugger. With the same bright blue eyes as her mother, Iris was tall with long blonde hair. She wore a beautiful floor-length red silk dress with huge gold hoop earrings. Not for the first time that day, Martha glanced down at her rather crumpled black pinafore dress and scuffed boots, feeling a little self-conscious. "And Toby, of course?" Iris reached out her hand to pull Toby forward. Martha tried her best to give a friendly smile.
"Can't believe we have to come all this way to see you when we only live about a mile apart."
Toby laughed loudly. Martha had forgotten about that laugh. He bent down to kiss Martha on both cheeks as Iris had done. "Getting my little sister out on a school night is impossible," said Iris. "Too much homework, I say." She grinned at her sister. "Ha, very funny." Martha turned to Liv. "Are the kids here?" "Left them with a babysitter. You'll see them tomorrow, though. We could go for a walk down at the beach." "Definitely." Martha smiled at the thought of the small stone beach they'd played on as children, just a short walk from the house. Hidden from the road, it was still a well-kept secret, and most of the time they had it to themselves. "So, Iris, how's it all going? Can't believe this time next week."
"I know, me neither."
Iris looked at Toby. "I feel like the luckiest girl in the world."
"Think I'm the lucky one,"
said Toby, planting a kiss on her forehead. He turned back to Martha.
"Iris tells me you're single. I hope this wedding stuff doesn't bore you too much."
Martha couldn't keep the look of surprise from her face. Yes, currently." She felt her cheeks begin to burn.
"Don't put her on the spot like that," chided Iris, poking her fiancé gently in the ribs with her fingers.
"No, it's fine, really," Martha shrugged. "But yes, still resoundingly single." She wondered exactly what Iris had told Toby.
"Here's your drink, darling."
Martha's father crossed the room and handed her a tumbler, ice clinking in the glass as he did so. "Thanks, Dad." She took a large gulp of the contents, the taste of juniper hitting her palate with force. She was grateful for the diversion. What have I missed? Martha's mother appeared and sat beside Liv on the sofa. I was just asking how everything was going, said Martha, before taking another sip. There was an awkward silence. Liv shifted in her seat. Jimmy stared at the floor. Martha looked around the room, no one quite able to meet her gaze. She glanced down at her drink, watching the bubbles rise. I'm sorry, Martha, I didn't mean to... Martha cut Toby off. No, it's fine, really. I know it's the elephant in the room. Toby didn't mean anything by it. Really, Martha, he doesn't know, said Iris. Martha stood up. Listen, I'm fine. Please don't think we have to avoid talking about weddings when I'm around. I'm not the first person to call off a wedding at the last minute, and I'm sure I won't be the last. She looked at them, smiling as convincingly as she could. Now, Mum, there must be something I can do in the kitchen to help. She got up and moved to the door, pushing down the feelings in her chest. That way she could pretend they weren't there. Most of the time, anyway. Chapter 2. 3 years earlier. Martha sat at her parents' kitchen table in an old t-shirt and leggings, squinting at the screen of her laptop. Where are your glasses? Her mother placed a cup of tea in front of her. I left them upstairs, but I'll wake Joe if I go in there again, and I want to leave him to sleep. He's shattered. Work seems to be relentless at the moment. How's the list coming along? Her mother sat opposite her. She was dressed in her gardening clothes, having been up early, as ever, to potter in her vegetable garden. Fine, Martha lied. She was, in fact, staring at a blank screen. She shut the laptop with a snap. How many are we up to? Her mother picked up an apple from the bowl on the table and bit into it. About 80. We're trying to keep the numbers down. Even saying the words made Martha feel nauseous. She tried to ignore the now familiar sinking feeling in her stomach. Everyone's so excited. I can't even pick up a pint of milk from the shop without someone asking me about it. Martha's mother smiled to herself, then looked at Martha. Mum, you know what? I might go down to the beach and have a quick swim before everyone's up. I've got this on underneath. She pulled at the strap of her swimming costume. And I grabbed a towel from upstairs. She gestured to the tote bag at her feet. Her mother looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. Perfect timing. Tide's almost in. It'll still be nice and quiet, too. You go. I'll make you some eggs when you're back, when Joe's up. Thanks, Mum. I'll be half an hour. She slipped her feet into some old trainers by the back door and headed down a path through the trees towards the beach. The sun was already warm on her face as she walked. Before she even saw the water, she could hear it. The gentle lapping of waves on stones, a sound so familiar she sometimes heard it in her sleep. The small cove was empty, the sky above the clearest blue. Martha took a deep breath, wanting to enjoy this perfectly still early summer morning. She balanced her mug of tea on a rock and slipped off her trainers before peeling off her leggings and t-shirt. Picking her way across the stones towards the stretch of sand by the shore, she stood for a moment, letting the water lap around her ankles. It was cold at first, but soon her skin had adjusted to the temperature. She walked until the water was up to her waist, then stood for a few seconds looking at the horizon. Breathing in deeply, she launched herself forwards, taking a few strokes before coming up for air, her bare feet finding the bottom. She loved being in the sea, but hated not being able to stand, fearing what lay beneath. Turning back towards the shore, she looked beyond and up. She thought of Joe, sound asleep in her old bedroom. It was barely a month before they were to be married. A fairy tale wedding, so everyone kept saying. But as the date grew closer, Martha felt a creeping sense of dread. Worse, she didn't really understand why. She and Joe had been together since their early 20s. His parents lived just a few miles away in a nearby village. They'd been good friends all through their teenage years, but only got together once they'd moved away. Reunited at a mutual friend's New Year's Eve party, Martha and Joe had bumped into each other at the bar and not stopped talking until they found themselves kissing at midnight as fireworks lit up the dark sky above them. It had all seemed so perfect. Two old friends, So much shared history and none of it complicated. Everyone loved Joe, especially Martha's family. As for his family, they were mad about Martha. She soon found herself moving into Joe's much bigger flat in London, not far from her job at the time as a teaching assistant at a large secondary school. He had a good job in finance, was paid ridiculously well for someone his age. They threw supper parties for their friends, went on mini breaks to cities all over Europe and spent endless weekends at various friends' weddings and birthday parties. Some of the people around them got married and before long started having children, and one evening Joe looked at Martha as they sat on the sofa eating their Chinese food straight from the takeaway box in front of the television. "Can you put your food down for a moment?" Martha looked up at Joe. "You okay? You've gone pale." "Please, Martha, put your box down for a moment." Martha did as she was told, reaching forward to put it on the small pine coffee table in front of them. She balanced her chopsticks carefully on the top and sat back, turning to Joe once more. He reached for her hands and took them in his own. "Will you marry me?" His voice shook a little. Martha looked at his kind, familiar face. She hesitated for a moment, not able to move her mouth. It felt as if it were clamped shut. "Martha?" Martha took in a deep breath. "Yes, Joe, I will marry you." His face crumpled with emotion. Thank God for that. He reached forward and wrapped her in his arms, knocking his takeaway onto the floor as he did so. "Thank you, Martha. You've made me the happiest man in the world." Martha hugged him back. "And me. Happiest woman." But as she said those words, something shifted inside her. At first she couldn't work out why she was feeling like this when she should have been so happy. But with a creeping sense of dread, she had to admit to herself that she was sleepwalking into a life that everyone expected her to have. The problem, not Joe, not her parents, her sisters or friends, even if it meant disappointing herself. In the months that followed, Martha felt as if she'd stepped aboard a train, speeding towards a destination she didn't really want to go to, but knowing it was too late to jump off. Her parents were over the moon, as was Liv. At the time, Iris had just extricated herself from a particularly exhausting relationship and was telling everyone who'd listen that marriage was a terrible idea. But she, like everyone else, loved Joe. Joe told Martha at every opportunity how much he loved her, how they were going to have the most fantastic life together. Martha smiled and returned similar promises. But she knew she didn't mean them like he did, and the more she said them, the more she hated herself for doing it. It was on a night out with Joni, after too many tequilas, the only way to do a night out as far as Joni was concerned, that Martha admitted how she really felt, out loud, for the first time. As they'd sat waiting for the night bus, sharing a bag of salt and vinegar-drenched chips, Martha had been answering Joni's questions about Joe and whether they were going to stay in London or move out to the suburbs, or worse, the countryside, and desert her, Joni's words, when Martha found herself saying she wasn't sure she was doing the right thing. "What do you mean, moving out?" Joni held a chip between her long fingers, stopping before it could reach her mouth. "I'd say that's definitely not the right thing to do. You'll be thinking it's acceptable to wear a fleece in no time." Martha took a deep breath. "No, I mean marrying Joe." Joni's mouth fell wide open. Martha saw the look of shock on Joni's face. "I know. I can't believe I'm saying it either." "Since when? I thought you two were like the real deal. What happened?" Martha shrugged her shoulders, her eyes now studying the cracks in the pavement. "I said yes because I thought I loved him. I do love him. The problem is—" Martha hesitated. "I don't think I love him enough." "Shit, Martha! The wedding's in a month's time. You have to tell him." "I've been trying to convince myself that I'll love him more as time goes by, but I know I can't do that to him. It's not fair. God, Joni, what have I done? I thought it would be all right." Joni sat back down and put her arm around her friend, still holding a chip between her fingers. "Listen, worse things have happened. Nobody died. But you've got to tell him now. Well, tomorrow when you're sober might be better, to be honest. Martha wiped the tears that had started to fall. I feel horrible about it. Is there someone else? No! Martha looked at Joni. Just checking. Joni took Martha's hand. You need to tell him, Martha. Leaving it any longer will only make it worse. I will, I promise. But Martha didn't tell him. Not that night, or the next day. She just couldn't bring herself to. And the longer she left it, the worse she felt, and the harder it became to live a lie. That morning, as Martha swam back towards the shore, Joni's words ran round her head. Martha and Joe had come down for the weekend to stay with Martha's parents, and his parents were due to come for dinner that evening. The thought of what she was about to have to do made her feel physically sick, but she knew it was time. She had to say something now, before the dinner. Martha headed back up to the house from the beach. She knew Joe would be devastated, but she had no choice. She took him his tea, then asked him to get dressed and meet her in the garden so they could talk. He looked at her quizzically, but simply nodded and said he'd be down in 10 minutes. Martha headed out into the garden by the back door to avoid having to face her mother, sat on a bench by the side of the beechwood behind the house and waited for Joe. He appeared shortly after, having thrown on his t-shirt and shorts. His hair was still ruffled from sleep. As he walked towards her across the lawn, Martha wished she could turn and run into the woods, disappear into the trees, and not have to say what she was about to say, ever. What is it? He sat down beside her. Joe, I'm so sorry. Martha forced herself to look at him, desperately trying to keep her voice steady. We can't get married. What? His voice was barely a whisper. Martha shook her head slowly. I'm so sorry. I don't understand. What do you mean, why? He stared at her in disbelief. I thought the feeling would go away, but I... What, Martha? Just say it. Even though she'd thought about this moment repeatedly since admitting how she felt to Joni, words now deserted her. You deserve better. He shook his head and laughed. Oh, come on, please don't do that. Give me a proper reason. Martha dug her nails into her palms. She hadn't wanted to say the words, but she knew she had to be honest. Joe, I'm so sorry. I don't love you enough to marry you. He screwed up his face. What does that even mean? You said yes. I know, and I shouldn't have. What the... So why did you? Because I thought it was what I wanted too, and I'm so sorry. I wish I didn't feel like this. It would all be so perfect, us getting married, but I'm not being honest with you. I think you're being very honest, don't you? His face drained of colour. I'm so sorry. Yes, we've established that. He let out another laugh, this time a hollow one. Well, I just wish you thought to tell me this before now, but thanks for your honesty, Martha. He spat the word out. How do you know? What do you mean? Her voice shook. How do you know you don't love me enough? Joe, please. Martha tried to reach for his hand, but he moved to stand. He turned to face her as she sat on the bench. Well, how do you know? Is there someone you love more? Is that how you know? No, I swear it's nothing like that. Joe, I do love you, but I know it's not right. To marry you, I mean. Fuck you, Martha. Joe stared at her, his eyes burning with fury now. Really, fuck you. He started walking back towards the house. She got up to follow him, reaching out for his arm. He shook her off without looking back. Please, Martha, do me a favour and leave me alone. I've heard enough. Please, listen to me. I said enough. Joe turned towards her and held up his arms. I don't want to hear it, Martha. He carried on walking back to the house, turning to look at her one last time before he disappeared inside. Martha knew the fallout was going to be bad, but nothing had prepared her for just how awful. Her parents, after getting over the initial shock, offered words of comfort, reassuring Martha it was better to be truthful, but they were obviously devastated. Liv tried to talk Martha round. Iris simply rolled her eyes, telling Martha she was far better off not getting married anyway. Joe refused to answer his phone or respond to any messages at all, so Martha tried to speak to his parents, calling them on their landline. Joe's mother put the phone down as soon as she heard Martha's voice. Unarranging the wedding was a truly hideous experience. The guilt she felt was crushing, but as far as she was concerned, she deserved to feel terrible for what she'd done. She insisted on doing everything that had to be done herself, telling the vicar, cancelling caterers and flowers and the wedding singer, a local Elvis impersonator, that had been Joe's idea. When it came to emailing the guest list telling them the wedding was off, Martha stared at a blank screen for what seemed like hours, wondering what to type. How could she tell her friends and family that she didn't love the person she'd agreed to marry enough to go through with it? That she hadn't said anything until the last minute because she'd been too scared to admit her true feelings? How it had been easier to go along with everything. That Sunday afternoon, Martha typed a short email stating that the wedding had been cancelled due to unforeseen circumstances. She pressed send only for her phone to light up with messages from friends asking her what had happened. She ignored them all, unable to face answering their questions. She moved her things out of his flat the following week. After she'd sent a few more messages that had gone unanswered, Joe had replied saying he would be out on the Monday evening so she could collect her things then. She let herself into the dark flat. The curtains were undrawn. Dirty plates were piled up in the sink and the bed was unmade. It didn't take Martha long to load her clothes into a few bags and clear out her things from the bathroom. She picked up a few of her photo frames, grabbed her pile of unread books from her side of the bed and rummaged in the kitchen cupboard for her favourite mug, one she'd had since she was a student. Everything else, she decided, was replaceable. An hour later, she pressed the doorbell of Joni's flat, bracing herself for Joni's questions, but instead her friend simply met her with a hug. "Hello, you." Joni squeezed her. Martha felt the tears coming again. "I'm a horrible person." "No, you're not. You've been honest. I mean, yes, technically it would have been easier if you'd not said yes in the first place, but at least you got there, in the end. You've done what lots of other people are probably too scared to do." "What do you mean?" "Not pick the easy option." "You really think so?" "Absolutely. You haven't settled for something just because it's better than nothing." "I really do love him, but not as I should. It's not like I've loved someone else more than him, ever. But I just know it's not enough." "Exactly, and that's why you've done the right thing. Martha, listen to me. Most women our age are freaking out about whether they should get married, and if they leave it too late, does that mean they'll miss out on having kids? But you've got to put yourself and your own happiness first. Work out what you want in life, not do things because you think it's what everyone else wants." "He won't even speak to me." "You've just broken his heart." Martha winced. "You need to leave him alone until he sees life does go on. Yes, it's an awful thing to happen, but like I said, you've done the right thing, and the braver thing too. So stop feeling sorry for yourself, get in here and make yourself useful. Open the bottle in the fridge door and let's have a glass of wine." "On a school night?" Martha raised an eyebrow. "I know, I'm making an exception. Now bung your bags by the sofa, you can stay as long as you need to." "Thank you." Joni smiled. "Come on, chin up, you've done the hard part." Martha nodded. "I still feel wretched." "Enough, you're boring me." Joni laughed and kissed Martha on the cheek. "Let's drink wine, watch telly and judge people. That's all